Facing a choice for the next half hour. I think rather than you can read the. You're reading the section on Judaism and conflict resolution, and so I just ask you to think about just one thing as you're reading, and that is the question of think about strategically how I'm trying to extrapolate from religious tradition in a very pragmatic way, rather than selling a theology. In other words, what's the difference between practices of a tradition and theology? So I'll give you an example. We'll talk about it more next time. But when the Dalai Lama asks everybody in the world to have a practice of concentrating for 5 minutes on the fact that we're all connected, and then breathing in, cherishing yourself, and breathing out, cherishing others, you really don't have to be a Buddhist to see the value of that, or to see the value of self-transformation that could come about by caring for yourself and then caring for others. You could easily see that as a Christian or a Jew or Muslim with the notion of loving your neighbor as yourself, that you have to love yourself and also have to love others. So that's an example of a pragmatic suggestion, very different than standard conflict resolution method. It's very internal, but having very practical impact on others. In some ways, that's all I tried to do in the Judaism section, which is to see whether there were discrete ideas or discrete practices, so that when Rabbi Meir has a practice of humiliating himself to some degree when there was a conflict between a husband and wife, that there's a transference going on where he allowed himself to be lowered in order to fix a problem between a husband and a wife. And the idea of working with this issue of honor and humiliation in creative ways. You remember in the Sulcha process that, and I had some debates about this when I was on the ground this time, that I forget, the person I was working with, a very smart professor in the school that I was working with, his name was, and I can't remember now for some reason his name. I can't remember his name, but he was very astute, very well read, and he felt that Sulcha was the wrong terminology for this process of reconciliation for people, because muslacha is more of a mutuality to that process. Sulcha involves some degree of humiliation of the party that's considered to be the bad party, or the party that's done wrong. And he didn't think that that would make sense in terms of conflict resolution between parties that both have claims against each other. So we had these interesting debates about that, and we're in the very pragmatic realm of practices that A, could be useful in a cultural setting, and B, maybe even have something to teach general practices of conflict resolution. So that if you were training police or military in any place in the world, it may be the case that giving indigenous examples of honor and humiliation and hospitality will serve them well when they're figuring out what to do and not to do in any environment, in any culture. So there's two reasons to get into practices. One is that practices avoid the divides of primary language and theologies that are unique. It focuses simply on things that seem to work with a lot of people. And in so doing, my modest attempt in this reading was to say, what can we learn from these individual practices? You would want to do the same thing with any religion or any culture in the world. What can be learned from a couple of thousand years of history of the lawyer Jurgar? What can be learned from that? What can be learned from what we know of certain Native American tribes and their focus on consensus building? There's two things to be learned. One, we may learn a few practices that work and that could be addressed universally. And two, you inherently honor people in all of the diversity, which is part of the message. And a good pushback, or a good rebuke, I'm not thinking of the right word, but a good rebuke of so-called universalist and colonialist presumptions of universality in a lot of this work. That if you I mean, I can imagine a new curriculum where, you do a conflict resolution training, and you have, one day on Sulcha practices, and another day on Lawyer Jurger, and another day on Indigenous American practices, and a fourth day on Christian approaches derived from Matthew, and on, and people start to get a sense that, gee, there's all sorts of ways to connect into this process. As opposed to everybody has to learn the same theory that we came up with at Harvard, which is its own kind of imperialism. It doesn't mean the Harvard theories aren't good. They may be very good. It may be that Fisher came up with some wonderful things for how everybody can win. It's not a disparagement of Western or rational approaches. It's that they can be very disempowering if they're seen as exclusive. They can be seen as bigoted if they're exclusive. Okay. Now, I just want to, so that's what I want you to sort of look for. Don't look for all this Jewish content as much as the example of it, and see what that raises for you in terms of other traditions and so on. So I wanted the last portion to just get a sense from you. I threw a lot at you in the first part. I want to get some feedback about this approach that I outlined, and what do you think the challenges are? What do you think the good things are? Yeah.
It's actually a question. Have you ever, in your practices, ever used a hybrid between the two? Hybrid between the universal methods of conflict resolution and adapting it to an indigenous framework?
Right. I'm constantly doing that. In other words, even though I'm describing, when I describe the hospitality experiment that we just did, I'm constantly informing what I'm doing and the decisions I'm making at every moment with cultural conflict analysis from Averick and from human needs. Everything I can remember, I put in the room. Framing and reframing. I'm doing them all at the same time. So I'm always hybrid. I mean, I'm always checking and rechecking and thinking on my feet about, and in some ways it's an inherent tension, and the creativity for me seems to come from the coexistence of opposites. So that I'll give you an example. My bent and instinct is to empower the kids and to have all of them feel as much an ownership as they can over the process. Okay? But there may be other people in the room from the culture who feel that it's very important for the students to show a lot of respect and to keep control. And so I'm going back and forth between what I think is a universal issue of empowerment versus a respect for a local culture that may have their reasons why they're keeping the kids under control more than I would. You see? So why do I keep those in tension? Maybe because of my own instincts that from my Jewish upbringing, that humility is a preeminent value. So I'm trying to hold back my academic bent or my Western bent all the time because, it says in Deuteronomy that Moses was the most humble of all prophets or of all men. So this idea that humility is a good value, which it isn't in Western Greek thinking. In Aristotle, humility is not a good value. But in biblical thinking, humility is the supreme value. So I'm reminding of myself of that, and then I'm stepping back and looking at the local culture. When you say a local culture may have wisdom that I don't, that's a lot of self-limitation. It takes a certain kind of stepping back. So I'm struggling with that all the time. It's versus the self-limitation of humility versus the notion that I think I have something to teach here that they may not have. So everything's a hybrid all the time. And that's where the creativity comes in. It's an art. Once you're in the field, this isn't a science, it's an art. Conflict analysis is a science, but this practice is an art, and very imperfect art. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to tell a story that sort of matches what you're saying, the practices work. I think, as you know, I've been to Africa, and that's the focus of my work. And I went in '98, in 2002, and 2006. And the story's from 2002. I had 6 church members with me, and we spent 2.5 weeks in Africa, mostly in a village that had theological students. So we spent half our time with theological students, the other half with these orphans. And we just sort of fell into this. I was doing a worship service, and the 6 other adults and I decided we were going to wash feet at the end of the worship service. That's a Christian tradition that Jesus did in the Last Supper, where he washed the disciples' feet. It never works in the United States because Americans are very conscious about their feet. You know, if I'm going to wash your feet, you're going to say, no, thank you. But over there, most people are barefoot. Their feet are dirty, sandy, hot, scars. I mean, they walk their whole life without shoes. So at the end of the service, we screwed up. We got some hot water. We wanted to bring hot water. There's no kitchens, there's no bathroom at the church, so we'd heat hot water, we put in a thermos. We didn't realize there was tea bags in the thermos. So at this solemn occasion, we're going to pour this water, and a giggling, and my friends are, what's the matter? We've got tea, we've made tea. So anyway, we're washing these people's feet, and these Africans, the tears are coming down their face, because we're on our hands and knees washing their feet. And they said it was like a turning over the colonial experience. For 300 years, they'd come to treat us like we were superior to them. You know, like when I would talk, they'd all be quiet. They'd greet us as we're walking. But once we did that, it was a way of showing something more profound than even we knew was going to happen. And since that time, I stay in email contact with 3 or 4 of them. It's very hard. They don't really have email, but they have access to it sporadically. They always talk about that night and that moment. It was so special for them and for us.
Now,
and it was the act. None of them remember what I preached on. I mean, I don't remember that. But I remember the washing their feet like it was yesterday.
Now
there was no conflict.
What do you make of the hermeneutic of the fact that you come there in 2000, whatever it was, what year was it?
2002.
In 2002, and as a missionary of a sort, with theological students, and your Christian gesture is the washing of the feet, which is perfectly rooted biblically. But what, for a few hundred years, preachers came to the same areas, and their Christian gesture was...
We taught them how to be Methodists in the United States.
Yeah.
We gave them a book of discipline. We gave them an order of worship. We gave them robes to wear, Christian music. The earlier missionaries...
All one-way teaching.
Yeah, they wouldn't let them use drums in worship because they considered that evil or wrong. So we were trying to do more indigenous thought with them, I think.
So the hermeneutics of it are that you could have had a hermeneutic that your goal in life is to witness for Christ and to teach and teach and teach. But you chose the hermeneutic of the washing of the feet, which is an entirely also indigenous to Christianity, and yet it had a completely different relationship to the other. Right? The other is viewed in a very different way. I mean, this is the remarkable thing about religious symbolism, isn't it? Yeah.
I have a question. You brought the students from the States, right, over to there. I was curious why, besides the connection with your student, why you chose students from here versus maybe students from over there.
Yeah, it was purely opportunity.
Purely opportunity.
Yeah, it was an opportunity with American Jewish or Australian Jewish or Moscow, Russian Jewish, but not indigenous Israeli.
Mm-hmm.
And if it had been indigenous Israeli Jewish, it would have been a much more complicated operation. I mean, it's really hard to describe how much division there is in the society, so that right across the street everything is divided. It doesn't look divided. It's the same highway. You don't see any barbed wire. Well, you see a lot of barbed wire, everybody sort of protecting themselves. you don't see this. You don't see this kind of exchange. Except one of the, I mean, the Arab kids were very, this wasn't easy for them because they're getting other information and messages from their elders and others. But one of the Arab kids came over to me privately and said, he knew exactly what he was doing, and he said, you know, most of my friends are Jewish. So I said, how is that possible? Because I saw this village as kind of a ghetto. He said, well, I live on the edge of the village, and the kibbutz is right across the street, so most of my friends are Jewish. He looked right at me, so he was making a statement. Most everything else is very segregated. So it's an interesting segregation. There's segregation there, and there's also self-segregation. And when you put two groups together who are indigenous, it would be far more complicated, and I didn't think it would be even wise for a group from the outside to even attempt that. We had more of an ownership over American Jewish youth than we did over having the right to do this with Israeli youth, but who knows what the future will bring. We may be able to partner with somebody else, and word of this may spread as a new method or a new way of interaction. Yeah.
When you were saying earlier about Jews being upset about different issues being spoken about in the public, I was just wondering about issues, for example, in Israel. With how are issues discussed if it's not in like controversial issues, if it's not supposed to be discussed?
Well, lots of things are talked about in the newspapers. The newspapers are free, so people are making positions and making editorials all the time,
Mm-hmm.
you know, against the government, for the government, and all that. What I meant more was that the religious style is to not air dirty laundry in public.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I shouldn't say that. There's lots of debate about many things, but there are other things that are taboo,
Okay.
like 1948. You know,
Oh.
what happened, or what happens in war. There's a lot of things that people don't talk about. And so, and that's true in every violent situation that I know about, is that everybody's holding secrets.
But if that's, I mean, like 1948 is so essential to the conflict. If
Yeah.
it's taboo to examine those issues, I mean, is that a major issue in trying to do peace building?
Well, it's a good question. I was in a session that I thought was particularly unhelpful, where somebody tried to deal with this. They put together a bunch of Jews and Arabs in a room, and they said, okay, we're going to mention a couple of words, and we're going to ask you how you feel about them. And one of them was 1948. And it didn't do a darn thing. Basically, people walked around the room, and it was just a series of propaganda speeches. Everybody had their own fantasy of what 1948 was. And in many ways, it was a learning experience about how hopeless the conflict really is, because the fantasies were unbelievable. Like I said, that was a dialogic place where basically everybody, it was a theater. And in my estimation, it was a theater of the absurd. It was a theater of the absurd. I mean, you had one person after another saying that we settled this place, there weren't any Arabs here. And people really believed that. And there's a good reason for them to believe that. If you came in 1947, 48, and you were in one part of Israel, and somebody said there's an abandoned piece of land, we'd like to go to settle it and make a Jewish settlement, and you have no idea who was there before, and in fact their memory was erased by the time you got there, you would have said it was an empty land and we went to settle it. I mean, it's amazing what people have done, and it's the same with you know, if the Arabs around the room say that there's no Jewish connection to this land, and you're sitting there as a Jew and you have these texts in front of you for 2,000 years that make Zion into the central aspect of your religious experience, you know, it's just laughable. It's a theater of the absurd. So we don't know how to talk about the most sensitive spaces. And my experience is that, again, the more you build around that, and you build a relationship, the more it's going to be possible to come to that most difficult place. It may be that you'll never talk about it, because I'm not sure words are the only way to do conflict resolution. I'm not sure that, there's many transformations in Germany today without, and at the same time, a lot of families never talking about what happened, where they were, what they did. But they're still changed their educational system and had a profound effect on them. So this question of how, ask yourself about family conflict. Ask yourself whether the only way to heal in a family is for people to say everything that happened to everyone, or ask yourself whether a lot of families are healed precisely because the worst things are never talked about. But they find another way to heal it. They never talk about the betrayal. They never talk about the abuse. They never talk about one uncle who stole everything. They just find another way to heal. Now that doesn't make rational sense, but it seems to be the way a lot of people get along. And it's kind of that way with enemy systems, in my opinion, too. It's not satisfying to those of us who want to talk out everything. Yeah.
Did you encounter any hostility from the Jewish community when, you sort of separated out these rituals and these traditions and these practices from their, theological and philosophical undertones?
No, because unless they were very extremist, they were proud of the fact that I could come up with something nice from their traditions. Okay? In general, most people are proud when you can come up with something from their tradition that that they would be proud of. That's not the problem. The problem is coming up with dirty laundry. That's the problem. That's when you encounter, vicious turning on you in an instant in many cultures, which has led a lot of us towards this approach to conflict resolution called appreciative inquiry. An appreciative inquiry could be accused of being too positive and not focusing on real problems. But one of the reasons is because people just can't talk about negative things. This is the fundamental divide between a human rights approach and a conflict resolution approach. Human rights, by definition, is always talking about everybody's dirty laundry. And the question is, how do you? So it's not when you. If you wanted, let me ask you a question. It's a good question for the United States right now. If we wanted to try to figure out how to get from A to B, or back to a civilization that absolutely rejects torture, how would we do that? We're in a mess right now. We're in a disaster when it comes to torture. How would we do that? There's two ways to do it. One is to expose all the torturers and to sit there ridiculously. The other one is to have a lot of proud speeches about an American tradition of the Bill of Rights and what it means and how many people's lives it saved around the world. And there are a lot of congressmen who, I have to admit, are very good at the second. They're very good at trying to reframe things in an appreciative inquiry to move things forward. And the left will ridicule them for that because they're not exposing the real truth. But I don't know, how could we have gotten a better Attorney General? How can we get another Attorney General that will absolutely forbid torture? How are we going to get from A to B? And this is a question about...
Is that a rhetorical question, or do you actually want to talk about
No, I don't know how.
Well,
And then we'll go to you.
In the
No.
readings.
No, she wanted to follow up.
Okay, go
Go
for it.
ahead.
Well, one thing that actually gets talked about a lot is the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of torture. I think there's
Yes.
a general consensus that from a rational perspective, torture doesn't necessarily get you the kind of information that you're looking for, and thus is sort of a waste of time, and ends up being more of a vengeful act than a productive act. And I think approaching things from that standpoint has has been productive, at least in an
Yeah.
academic sense.
We tried that on Capitol Hill. I met people with the CIA who tried that. It doesn't seem to help. That's the rational approach. I'm not condemning it. I'm saying it's good to do that research. I'm not sure that's going to change. My experience is that if we had a much more robust group of military people who reframed what it is to fight with honor, and what is a true man of honor, and push that. And if Webb does that from his position as senator, and maybe McCain, maybe if we got a consensus of people who said, what is it to fight honorably, and this is the way that Americans should be in the world. A Sun Tzu approach to war, which is the most honorable fight is the one you don't have to do, and all these things that could reframe what it is to be a strong, proud man. And that this gets into the whole issue of male psychology and conflict that I'm very interested in. I think that could insert itself into the emotional neural network here that's working for torture in a far more effective way than saying it's not useful. It just hasn't helped. It hasn't helped. There seems to be an instinct anyways to say, well, that's just liberal crap, and it does help. Or, I don't know what. It just doesn't seem, we're not competing. I keep believing that so much of conflict resolution is about competition for models of humanity rather than problem solving. That, to say that it doesn't work is a problem solving approach to torture. And what I'm suggesting is that torture is, it's a given. Take the next step. If we know that torture is not effective, and people are pursuing it relentlessly anyways in one generation, but didn't 10 years ago, then there's something much, much more insidious at work than a rational calculation. So if it's not a rational calculation that's leading to the torture, then it must be a non-rational thing that has to compete with that. And that non-rational thing is our image of ourselves. Who do we want to be? Who are we? Who is it? What is an American man? Who is an American man? What is manhood? I think that's the central place to compete with the notion that a real man is a person that can waterboard. I think that's the central question, and that means it takes emotions, it takes charisma. What is the book that from the Emory University professor that Bill Clinton is touting, Emory University psychology professor, if somebody could find out by next class. It's a book on, it's really a partisan book about why Democrats are sending the wrong message. Democrats are talking to the electorate's head, and Republicans talk to the electorate's heart. And the key is to find the heart messages. Effectively, I'm saying the same thing. Because I'm absolutely convinced that torture is not about the head. It's about the heart, and anybody in intelligence knows that. So why is it happening so? And okay, let's say we do know why. It's about revenge, or about some version of manhood that comes out in places of extreme conflict. Well, what can we compete with? How has it been defeated in the past? How was McCarthy defeated in the United States? He wasn't defeated by people saying that he wasn't getting at the real communists. They're saying that this isn't what we're about. This is why he was defeated in the end. Yeah, last question.
In the readings for this week, you wrote a lot about forgiveness, and I'm wondering if you know of any research that's been done on the art of apology. Because I know from a micro perspective, if I've been wrong in any way, shape, or form, and if someone has a sincere apology that they offer, that cuts through so much.
Yes. I think there's a lot of people who have done interesting work on forgiveness, but not apology. And part of the reason for that is because the neo-Protestant culture in the United States was much more interested in the forgiveness word than the apology word. Because forgiveness seemed to be more in line. Well, Jesus forgives. He doesn't apologize. And so that whole thing of Jesus' forgiveness and us and everything was more central to the Christian story, or the Protestant story. But I think it doesn't do justice to the full biblical narrative or to the Christian narrative, because apology really is about confession. And confession is a very big theme. And I think it's been understudied, in my experience, because of this. I'm uncomfortable with forgiveness in here, because apology is far more universal than forgiveness is much more controversial between cultures and how it's mediated. But apology, if you include in apology both